Let's talk about the history of plant propagation. So far you've learned a bunch of different techniques for different types of plants and their growth forms. Now let's look back and see how propagation first originated with humans, but mostly within North America, and also ending the lecture with some information about local history of plant propagation. On a large temporal scale, humans are thought to have started manipulating plants for agriculture and horticulture around 10,000 years ago. Worldwide, that varies a little bit, and there's controversy on exactly when that started. It isn't super important, especially for this class, but just of interest. And some of the places where it's thought that agriculture first began, and that also means like where we have the oldest evidence of agriculture, is in Northeast Africa, the Middle East, Mexico, Central and South America, and China. So some of the earliest plants domesticated were seed plants, cereals like wheat, barley, rice, and legumes like beans and peas. Corn was also domesticated during this time too, the early times of agriculture. And the reason I'm bringing up early domesticated agricultural crops is that was just the first steps of humans really working with and manipulating the growth of plants and their distribution and selectively breeding them, and which led to, and is intricately entwined with propagating plants. So not necessarily always for food, but sometimes for food. And so the same techniques that came out of agriculture are used now in plant propagation. And these plants were all propagated by cuttings. We have early in the history of agriculture, it was known that grapes and figs, olives, potatoes, yams, bananas, and pineapples were all propagated through cutting. So the stem cutting, root cutting technique has been around for thousands of years. Pineapples, for example, are native to South Brazil and Paraguay, and cultivation spread north to the Mayas in the Yucatan area of what's now Mexico. And that spread north through South America and south, but it eventually reached the Caribbean, Central America, and Mexico, where it's cultivated largely by the Mayas and Aztecs. And Columbus learned about that in 1493 when he was on the island of Guadalupe off of Baja and saw pineapple cultivation there. It's just a little historic anecdote for you. Grafting has also been around a long, long time. It seems like people wouldn't have figured that out so quickly, but again, people have been manipulating and working with plants and depending on them for so long that they've been creative with the plants for a long time too and figured a lot of things out early. Here are 5 different species and their location of origin. Corn is native to what is now Mexico, or what is called Mesoamerica, so kind of in between North America and South America. Thought to be pretty much narrowed down to one particular valley area in south central Mexico, where it's thought that corn was first cultivated and bred from other wild grasses. So that's pretty cool. And potatoes are native to Peru, mostly higher altitude, rocky soils. But Peruvian people up in the Andes, were very good at growing potatoes for thousands of years. Citrus is native to tropical Asia and Malaysia. Apples native to the Middle East, first cultivated in Kazakhstan. And rice is native to Southeast Asia, pretty widespread there. So native, again, think about that. It doesn't mean the plants that we see today are what used to grow there. It means that they're ancestors, so a wild relative of what we know now as corn, potatoes, citrus, apples, and rice. Wild relatives were grown or were living in those locations. For example, the wild apple in Kazakhstan is just a small, hard, fairly bitter fruit. It was bred over millennia to produce this big, juicy, sugary fruit. So, but those are its wild relatives. And without those, we wouldn't have the good fruits that we have today. An early location of plant propagation, Machu Picchu in Cusco, Peru. Thousands of years ago, really high elevation, highly organized and complex agriculture and horticultural practices were being done. Well, from the 1400s to the 1600s, the European people started really exploring and leaving their homelands to look for new trade, new routes to other parts of the world. Christopher Columbus was one of them. It opened the world up to more exploration for Europeans to explore more of the world, although the world was already populated with indigenous peoples. But the thing that changed was that the communication and transfer of goods and plants and seeds and other things between parts of the world that didn't used to be connected started to be more connected. So potatoes, for example, were brought from Peru back to the old world, like to Europe, and there started to be a trade back and forth, and we started to see cultivation and propagation of those species on two different continents instead of just one where they were originated to and was their ancestral home. So as I've been saying, tomatoes, potatoes, beans, and corn, those were all native to the New World, meaning to North, Meso, or Middle and South America was called the New World by the Europeans, but it wasn't new to those people that already lived there. But those were brought back to Europe and started to be grown there. I mean, potatoes are, as in my era, my life, I've always thought potatoes, were from Idaho or from Ireland because I've read about and learned about the Irish potato famine. But they were all from Peru and the Peruvian Andes. That's where they all came from, no matter where you've heard about them from. Sometimes crops like potatoes were taken back to Europe and did really well there. But some also, like corn, were definitely taken back, and Europeans that brought corn back from like Mexico area and from North America and brought them back to Europe, they were super excited about this grain crop, but it didn't grow very well there at all. So it was kind of left on the wayside, and no one has been propagating or growing corn in Europe since then. So some were successful, some were not, but there was beginning to be communication and goods transferred between these two previously disparate areas of the world. A good example of early propagation is the tulip in the 1500s, starting from in the area of Holland, and started propagating, manipulating, and breeding these because they're really important to them as a culture and in their economy as well. So it's been around for a long time. Here's a painting from around 1600 and showing you early grafting techniques happening. This is a close-up of a man doing a graft on the scion wood onto the cut stump of a tree. It looks like the cleft graft. A Swedish botanist came up with and developed this binomial scientific naming of species. His name was Linnaeus, and this was developed in 1753. And although this is a European way of looking at plants and the plant world, like Western culture, it has become a common language between peoples different countries and even indigenous peoples, a common language to talk about plant species and individual plants. Now, people all over the world, before the Europeans brought so much commerce and communication between different parts of the world, people knew about their plants, their regional plants, their local plants, even some plants from far away. But often, sometimes the plants would not have distinct names, and people would have to describe and tell stories about the plants and talk about their functions and uses to be able to understand what plant was being talked about. This binomial system that Linnaeus proposed and came forth with allowed everyone throughout the world to be able to have a particular name for every single species, a unique species, and it kind of gave a language currency that was available to everyone. Still, if you work with local people or indigenous people, or they're always going to have their own names, common names, and stories about plants, and those are equally as valid. They just might be harder to communicate that to someone else who's not from that area if that other person is trying to understand what plant you're talking about. One of the first commercial nurseries in the United States, so now we're kind of just focusing on North America, was Prince and Sons Nursery, established in 1730 in New York, and mostly just fruit trees. That's mostly what people wanted. They still, kind of the front yard idea hadn't really been created yet, so people had land and small farms, and they wanted production, they wanted food, so mostly fruit trees, and this became one of the first places to distribute to large numbers of people fruit trees. If before that you had to grow your own from grafting or from seed or get one from someone who had them, some local source, so it was not easy to find fruit trees before that. Major botanic gardens throughout the world also were places of early plant propagation, relatively early, more in kind of the more recent times, like at Kew Gardens. And at Kew, Sir Joseph Banks became well known and very involved in plant propagating, collecting and propagating species from all over the world, which kind of set the foundation for those species, some of them to become available to people all over the world too. The oldest greenhouse in the United States, built before 1800, is in Waltham, Massachusetts, and that's the Lyman Estate. And it houses grapevines planted in 1870 from cuttings that were from England. So it's got some good history there. Some plants that you may have heard of and their origins. The Orient was explored by people from North America for plants that could do well here, and rhododendrons was one of them. They became something that was shipped over here, and people started growing them on the East Coast and Midwest as the United States was being settled. Mostly because rhododendrons are beautiful, of course, and people started wanting to plant things that made around their homes look attractive. People have always probably enjoyed flowers, but it became formalized in a business in the early 1700s and 1800s. And the reason parts of China especially were a good place to look for plants is that the climate was very similar in parts of China to the East Coast and the Midwest of the United States. Cold, snowy, freezing winters and warm, humid, wet summers. Lilies, a beautiful flower for the garden, also came from Asia. Roses have been revered for 1,000 years, and these originated in China as well. Of course, what North America had to offer the world of landscaping is evergreen trees and shrubs and deciduous trees and shrubs, which we had many, many different species on our Midwest and East Coast of the United States and Canada as well. And there's very few in Europe. So, overall, so these became something that was exported there. Here are a couple of organizations that deal with plant propagation. a great resource for learning about plants that some new species you're trying to propagate. Places to go for information. I usually look in a couple of books I've got. If there's no information there, I'll go online. And then at that point, I might do a number of things. I might directly just call someone I know. Have you propagated this? Do you know how to? Do you know who I would talk to about this? That's the way I like to do it, but you could also connect with research being done and people at like the International Plant Propagator Society, and they probably have some information on it. There's also the American Society for Horticulture, and that's a good one too as a resource. For a more regional research source, I would look at Pacific Horticulture. Sunset Western Garden Book has care of plants, not really propagation information, but it's not a bad place to just learn more about the plant itself and the biology, and that might lead you to some information on how to propagate it. Now let's talk about a few people that ran nurseries and propagated plants here locally. Francesco Franceski came to live in Santa Barbara in 1893 when he was 50 years old, and he developed a nursery here that listed over 2,000 different plants that he propagated and sold. They were gathered from all over other Mediterranean regions of the world. He created a 40-acre botanical park near his home. It's now the city of Santa Barbara's Franceschi Park, which is kind of on the Riviera. Kind of a cool spot. It's a little bit neglected now, overgrown plants and things, but it's in a beautiful spot overlooking downtown, and it has a lot of old specimen trees, meaning these big old trees that were planted a long time ago that have turned into these beautiful specimens of mature trees that he planted, and some of them that he actually brought over from other parts of the world and to propagate here in town and sell. So although Franceschi Park has Francesco Franceski's house still standing on it, and although it's kind of in disrepair and the grounds aren't highly manicured, it's still a really neat spot to check out. You'll find some really old examples of common trees that were propagated and planted by Franceschi. So check that out when you get a chance. Joseph Sexton was the earliest Santa Barbara nurseryman, and he was looking to start a nursery here in town in 1867. He came and looked around. He started one at the corner of Montecito and Castillo Streets, so right here, kind of just right below City College. He expanded his nursery and bought 65 acres in Goleta, where he built a home and had a large nursery there. You can still visit that site too. So Joseph Sexton's home and nursery were built in Goleta. This is at the corner of Highway 217 and Hollister. And you can walk around there. There's a hotel that kind of surrounds and goes behind it now. Tried to build itself with a similar style to this mansion. One of my friends actually rented a room in the top of this mansion's old historic mansion. But a lot of neat, huge old trees of things you see often around town that never get that big, like eugenias is a really common shrub and hedge plant around town. It's got those reddish leaves. And you can see a giant tree of eugenia here. There's a bunch of other specimen trees there too. It's fun just to walk around for a little while. Sexton's nursery was one of the best known in the United States at that time, early 1900s. He introduced a couple of species. One was the Persian walnut, and also he made popular the Cherimoya. Here's a list of some of the plants that existed on the property there in 1965. And I went there a few years ago and found all of these plants still growing there. So neat place to see really big examples of mature trees of things that we see often, but that aren't that old yet. There's a giant example of the Araucaria bidwillii, and another large example of the paperbark tree. Both this and the previous slide found on that Sexton property. Joseph Sexton was also responsible for introducing the Norfolk Island pine, or the star pine, to this area. And on his property still exists a giant star pine, that one on the right there. Joseph Sexton also grew calla lilies at his Goleta ranch, and he also grew Argentinian pampas grass that he brought and to sell those flowering stalks that look like a huge feather. And there was a big demand for them at that time for decorative purposes and even putting in ladies' hats. And he propagated a pure white cultivar of that that could be dyed easily different colors and exported these for about 5 years and got $25 for every 100 plumes. He made a good living at it. Sexton's wife, Lucy Sexton, was an environmental horticulturist, and she also had a big influence on the horticulture kind of circles at that time. She was an authority on native plants and was caretaker of 50 acres of land and restoring a lot of it to its natural vegetation. Elwood Cooper was also an important propagator and nurseryman here in the Santa Barbara area around 1900. Some of the things we now know, named after him, the Elwood Preserve, Elwood School, etc., used his first name, which is unusual. I don't know why they use that instead of his last name, but that's how it is. Around the 1870s, he purchased a small 2,000-acre ranch northwest of Santa Barbara, where he focused on a number of different plants, but eucalyptus was one of the big things he focused on. And he thought in this dry climate that doesn't have a lot of trees and not great soil, he thought eucalyptus were the answer, that put in eucalyptus and we could get forests where there were nothing, because the eucalyptus can grow in poor soils and in dry conditions like they do often in Australia. He also grew lots of different olives for olive oil industry, and it was a good competitor with Italy's olive oil industry until Sicilian olive oil was imported at a much cheaper rate, and then he kind of went out of business with that. As Cooper's business progressed, he changed to becoming a eucalyptus grower for the reasons that I mentioned. He thought that we would have a hardwood shortage here in the United States with all of the settlement happening and building homes, etc. He propagated many eucalyptuses and sold them to people who heard that these trees could grow fast, produce good wood, and live on poor soil and took little water. And he rode the crest of that wave of growing eucalypts for quite a while, but at some point that many of the trees started to die out from drought and frost and neglect. The wood was good for burning, but not for building. And they tried to actually build some of our piers with eucalyptus wood, and they didn't realize that that wood will twist when it gets wet or dries out. So it really wasn't good building wood. His little idea for reforesting this area with eucalypts didn't really work. On the top image there, you're seeing eucalypts, sometimes called ukes or eucalypts or eucalyptuses. They are growing in their native habitat in Australia in that top picture. But he grew them here, and he even wrote a book about them. And even though they didn't take on as this big, great lumber tree, they've definitely added a lot of character to our region. And they were grown in other places, and he learned a lot about growing them and propagating them and pest control with them as well. So he became an expert, and his information on the growth of eucalypts was highly valued. Not related to Elwood Cooper, but I just have to show you this one eucalyptus, which is just amazing. It's called rainbow eucalyptus. They're both pictures of the same species, and when they're wet, the outer kind of dry bark falls off. Underneath is this rainbow of colors, so they're just beautiful. And as I said, Elwood Cooper came up with what could be called the first IPM, or integrated pest management techniques of controlling a pest. He experimented with lots of different toxic sprays, spending tens of thousands of dollars in trying to eradicate black scale from his walnut orchards. And he imported ladybugs from China that were predatory on the black scale, and it worked. So this is one of the first times we will see this type of kind of natural IPM that was applied about 130 years ago. He was also elected president of the California State Board of Horticulture. And like I said before, Mrs. Cooper was interested in the region's wild plants, and she sent some specimens she could identify to Asa Gray at Harvard, where many of those at that time were unknown, were named. For example, the Cheilanthes cooperae, it's the Cooper's fern, was named after really her. So that's pretty cool. Just a couple more pretty pictures of a eucalyptus. They're very beautiful. They're blooming now in the springtime, March, and causing lots of allergies for me, but still I really appreciate their beauty.